Okay, so in today's video, I'm going to show you how I would do part 6 of the C2 Proficiency exam, reading and use of English section. So what is in part 6? It says a text from which paragraphs have been removed and replaced in jumbled order after the text. Candidates must decide from where in the text the paragraphs have been removed. So basically, got a text with gaps, just like in PET and in first and in advanced. In C2, it's more difficult. You've got a whole big paragraph removed from certain points of the text. There are 7 paragraphs missing from the text with 8 possible options with which to fill those gaps. So we're testing here in this part your understanding of cohesion, coherence, text structure, and global meaning. So the normal technique, what they normally tell you to do here is read the text, ignore the gaps, then have a look at the options. I don't think that that's an efficient use of time. I'm going to show you what I would do in this section, and hopefully you'll agree that that is a better way of doing it. So first of all, let's just start reading what this text is about. So it says, a fog catches forest. A bare, dusty island where the rain never falls could soon be covered with trees, Fred Pierce reports. Okay, so what I'm going to do, just going to read this first paragraph here, and I'm going to focus on the first gap and look at all the possible options for that first gap and find the one that I think is the correct answer for that first gap. And if I'm not absolutely sure, well, I'll say maybe it's A or maybe it's F, whatever. But I think we can start to narrow it down right from the first gap. You can usually find the correct answer. Let's have a look. When Spanish sailors landed in the Canary Islands in the 15th century, they were amazed to discover an Aboriginal population with extensive agriculture, which they had somehow managed to sustain with virtually no rainfall. Legend has it that the Guanche people derived all their water from a single large tree, which stripped moisture out of the atmosphere, out of passing fogs, and dripped enough water from its leaves to support 1,000 people. However true the story may be, there is no doubt that the only thing stopping the Canaries from resembling the Sahara Desert just 70 kilometers to the east is the moisture-rich fog that drifts in from the Atlantic Ocean. Okay, so now I'm going to have a look at the options. I'm going to have a look at option A first of all. Could this be what goes in gap number 37? This more ambitious scheme could be managed in one of 2 ways, he says. More ambitious scheme. So that sounds like we've compared 2 plans, 2 schemes, 2 ways of doing something, and one is more ambitious than the other. This more ambitious scheme, we have to have mentioned at least 2 schemes, 2 ways of doing things. I don't see that. Also, he says, who is he? I don't think we've mentioned anybody, not the writer, not anything, in that first paragraph. I don't think it can be A. Personally, I don't think A is a possibility. Let's look at B. The results look promising. The results of what? I mean, let's look at that last sentence of the first paragraph. We're talking about the geography of the Canary Islands. How it's similar to the Sahara Desert, but there is a moisture-rich fog that drifts in from the Atlantic Ocean. We think that's where, or they think that that's where the Guanche people got their water from. The results look promising. The results of what? There hasn't been an experiment. I don't think it can be B. It then says a litre a day should be enough to support 1 seedling. A seedling is like a baby tree. 1 seedling. We haven't mentioned growing trees. No, it's not B. Centuries ago, the island's inhabitants carved tunnels up the mountainside and into the underground aquifers. Possibly. These drained into collecting areas lower down. Once the island's main source of water, they could be brought back to life by reinstating the cloud forest. I mean, what could be brought back to life? Yeah, it's again, something has been mentioned in the previous paragraph. We don't know what can be brought back to life. They're starting to talk about how water would have been collected. It's not very coherent. Let's have a look at D. In times gone by, all 7 of the islands had rich cloud forests that trapped moisture from the trade winds and quenched an otherwise dry region. Well, we are talking about how the Canary Islands are very similar to the Sahara Desert, except for this moisture-rich fog that comes off the Atlantic Ocean. D's looking good. More recently, though, much of the island's forest has been lost, removed for firewood, construction, and to make way for farmland. Most of the islands still have some degree of forest cover, but one, Lanzarote, is all but bare. Okay, so we're talking about the fact that the forests have disappeared from the islands. Let's see if that is coherent with what comes in the next paragraph. It says, sometime in the last century, the last of the trees on high ground were cut down and the land began to dry out. I think we've got our answer. Yeah, it looks like they're talking about deforestation still. I think in principle, I would say here, D is the correct answer for 37. Let's see if it works out as we move on. So, sometime in the last century, the last of the trees on high ground were cut down and the land began to dry out. This meant that across much of the north of the island, agriculture went into decline. Now, David Rybold, a forestry scientist turned school teacher who owns a home on the island, has a plan to reverse the trend. He wants to use artificial fog harvesting to bring back the cloud forest in what promises to be the largest reforestation project ever attempted using the technology. Okay, let's go back and look at the options we've already looked at. We should be getting quicker at this now because we'll recognize or we'll remember what we've already seen. So, A, this more ambitious scheme would be managed in one of 2 ways. Well, okay, so we're definitely talking about a scheme. My problem here is that it says more ambitious. It's like it's comparing it to some other plan, to some other scheme. Again, it just doesn't sound right. He has a plan, which you could call a scheme. I just don't think it's more ambitious than any other scheme. I don't think we have seen any other scheme, any other plan yet. So I don't think it's A. The results look promising. Well, again, I don't think we've got any results yet. He says he wants to use artificial fog harvesting to bring back the cloud forest in what promises to be the largest he wants to do this. I don't think we've actually carried out any experiments yet, so we can't really have any results yet. A litre a day should be enough to support one seedling. Again, a litre a day, he hasn't said how he's going to collect water. I assume it means water to water the seedlings, the baby trees. Again, it just doesn't sound coherent. Let's have a look at C. Centuries ago, the island's inhabitants carved tunnels up the mountainside. Well, this could be comparing artificial fog harvesting. Possibly. Carved tunnels up the mountainside and into the underground aquifers. These drained into collecting areas lower down. Once the island's main source of water, they could be brought back to life by reinstating the cloud forest. For years, Ribald watched these failed attempts by local foresters. So my problem here is in the next paragraph. C looks okay for a minute in 38, but then for years, Ribald watched these failed efforts. Ribald is a person who is alive now. David Ribald is a scientist who lives in the Canary Islands now. I don't think he watched the failed attempts by local foresters. We're talking about the island's inhabitants centuries ago. He didn't watch those people. There's something that doesn't work out there. I don't think it's D because we think D's in 37. Let's have a look at E. Marciano Acuna, the local town councillor in charge of the environment, says he hopes the trees will trigger a more widespread greening of northern Lanzarote and have an impact on the whole ecology of the region. Okay, so we're talking about a reforestation project. So they haven't really explained how they're going to do it yet, which is what you'd expect. It says using the latest technology there at the end of the paragraph. You'd expect them to go on to explain how they're going to do it before they start talking about what the town councillor believes will be the benefits of this project. Okay. I think the clue is going to have to be in the paragraph that comes after the gap. For years, Ribald watched these failed efforts by local foresters. So let's go to the end of option E. Once the trees are back, the quality of the soil will improve and the long-lost forest ecosystem will have a chance to return, providing a habitat for species that long since confined to other islands in the Canaries. It has no link to the next paragraph. For years, Ribald watched these failed efforts by local foresters. We're not talking about anything that local foresters attempted to do. We're talking about the benefits of the reforestation in it. It's not E. Let's have a look at F. Even in the hottest months, clouds form over the mountains of northern mountains of northern Lanzarote. As the trade winds blow over the island, the mountains force moisture-rich vapor into droplets. Okay, this could be them talking about how they would harvest the moisture-rich air, the fog, possibly. The surface of the mountain is too hot for this to happen at ground level, so the fog rarely touches the ground. That's why the saplings died, says Ribald. Well, we haven't mentioned any saplings yet. Saplings, again, like seedlings, young trees. It doesn't sound very coherent because we haven't mentioned any saplings. They never got tall enough to touch the fog and capture the moisture on their leaves. For years, Ribald watched these failed efforts by local foresters. Maybe it's just they didn't mention any local foresters yet. They haven't been mentioned yet. So I don't think it can be F. What about G? Farmers would certainly benefit. This farmers would certainly benefit. The emphasis there as though lots of people would benefit. Farmers would certainly benefit. Well, we haven't really spoken much about the project yet. I think this is the problem. As water in Lanzarote has become very expensive and there are tight restrictions on the irrigation of farmland, this has made agriculture increasingly difficult, and combined with the rise of tourism as a source of revenue, has turned it into weekend occupation at best for many residents. It has turned farming, agriculture into a weekend occupation for many residents. For years, Ribald watched these failed efforts by local foresters. Again, no mention of local foresters or anything that they attempted to do. Let's have a look at H. It's our last option, so I'm assuming it must be H. The bare hills in this region have been of increasing concern to the island's authorities. Okay, we're talking about reforestation, a reforestation project, and now the bare hills, the hills that, bare means without anything, so without trees. Despite numerous attempts, okay, so we're talking about an attempt. Let's see if the local foresters attempting to do something. Despite numerous attempts in the past decade, all replanting schemes have so far been unsuccessful, right? Okay, so we're talking about people who failed to do something. With limited water supplies on the island, the newly planted trees dried out and died, leaving the hilltops littered with hundreds of dead saplings. This makes sense, yeah, absolutely. For years, Ribald watched these failed efforts by local foresters, and then he read about a successful research project in Chile, which harvested the fogs that regularly rolled in from the Atacama Desert. Nets erected on a ridge facing the ocean provided enough water for a small town. Realizing that Lanzarote's climate was very similar to Chile's, Ribald began to wonder whether fog harvesting could be used to keep the saplings alive. Okay, so we've got D and H, I think, pretty much eliminated from the options here. Let's have a look at 39 then. Okay, so we're talking about the comparison between Chile and Lanzarote and the fog harvesting that could be used to keep the saplings alive. Okay, this more ambitious scheme could be managed in one of two ways. Again, okay, we're talking about a plan, yes. But we're still talking about the same plan. And now the only difference is that they have explained how it's being done. It could be, maybe it's a more ambitious scheme than what the local foresters had done in the past, so maybe. Either the hilltops could be covered with nets to grow new forests all at the same time, or this could be done in stages with a smaller number of nets being moved around to reforest each area in turn. After perhaps 2 years of water from the fog collectors, saplings would be tall enough to collect the fog water themselves. Okay, so it goes into the plan a little bit. So it could be A. Let's have a look. It goes on to into the next paragraph. On paper, fog harvesting looks like a solution to the island's reforestation problems. But convincing the authorities to give it a try wasn't easy. I think 39A is a possibility. Let's just have a look and see if there are any others. The results look pleasing. I don't think that's really coherent, B, because we're still in the process of talking about how Ribald realized that Lanzarote's climate was very similar to Chile's and that they could use fog harvesting to keep saplings alive. A litre a day should be enough to support one seedling, and Ribald has found that on some sites a square metre of net catches on average 2 litres of water each day. I mean, they're talking about results here in B. And yet in the next paragraph it says on paper fog harvesting looked like a solution, but convincing the authorities to give it a try wasn't easy. So we're still talking about the process of getting the authorities to agree to giving it a try, to attempting it. So I don't think it can be B. Centuries ago, the island's inhabitants. I think that's going into a different technique. I think that would be, I think C isn't possible either. I don't think D is, because I think we're going to say that D is in 37. It's getting complicated. Let's have a look at E. Okay. Marciano Acuna, the local town councillor in charge of environment, says he hopes the trees will trigger a more widespread greening of northern Lanzarote and have an impact. So this is town councillor talking about the positive things of the reforestation project, and yet after 39, after the gap, it says how difficult it was to convince the authorities. So not very coherent. No, I don't think it's E. What about F? Even in the hottest months, clouds form over the mountains of northern Lanzarote. As the trade winds blow over the islands, the mountains force moisture-rich vapour into droplets. The surface of the mountain is too hot for this to happen at ground level. So the fog rarely touches the ground. That's why the saplings died. Well, now that's interesting, because we have spoken about in the previous paragraph, realizing that Lanzarote's climate was very similar to Chile's, Ribald began to wonder whether fog harvesting could be used to keep the saplings alive. So Ribald was wondering if they could use fog harvesting to keep the saplings alive. And then it says that as at ground level, the mountain is too hot. The saplings died for that reason. That sounds good. They never got tall enough to touch the fog and capture the moisture on their leaves. I think F is definitely a possibility, yeah. I think F is definitely a possibility. I think it may be a better one than A. I think we're going to have to decide between F and A here. I still have a problem in A where it says this more ambitious scheme. We haven't really spoken about a plan before that in detail. A couple of paragraphs before, we spoke about the failed attempts to reforest. Yeah, it's a difficult one. So it could be A or F. Maybe we'll see if A or F are going to fit in a different gap later on. But at the moment, I don't think it's 100% clear. I don't know if anyone who's watching this can see whether there's a definite answer, whether it's definitely A or F. That's really difficult. That's really difficult. They both look good. Okay, well, we'll read on. On paper, fog harvesting looked like a solution to the island's reforestation problems, but convincing the authorities to give it a try wasn't easy. For many years, Ribald tried and failed to convince anyone to back his idea. It took the arrival of a new mayor to finally get his scheme approved. Proyecto David, as the locals called it, got underway. And the town authorities erected 8 modest fog collecting devices on 3 of Lanzarote's mountains. So, in 40, we're talking about what has happened, right? So they did eventually erect 8 modest fog collecting devices on 3 of Lanzarotte's mountains. Is A a possibility here? Let's have a look in 40. This more ambitious scheme could be managed in 1 or 2 ways. I don't think this is more ambitious. It seems less ambitious because we've just called it a modest fog collecting. The authorities erected 8 modest fog collecting devices. Isn't modest and ambitious kind of contradictory? Yeah, I wouldn't say A could go there, I don't think. What about B? The results look promising. Okay. From the fog collecting devices that they've put up on the mountains, the results look promising. A litre a day should be enough to support one seedling, and Rybold has found that on some sites, a square metre of net catches on average 2 litres of water per day. One site averaged 5 litres a day, even at the hottest time of the year. Important now, the next paragraph. This summer, having declared the initial experiment a success, the Island Council plans to install 8 much larger devices. Well, yeah, it's a success because of what we've just said in B. Yeah, I think it's very clear. I think we've got 37, 38, and 40. I think are very clear. I think we've got D, H, and B written off now. Okay, so the Island Council plans to install 8 much larger devices which will discharge water into a pumped drip irrigation network designed to keep the saplings watered. Rybold hopes that this will form the pilot phase of a full-scale reforestation of the mountains of northern Lanzarote. Okay. Rybold hopes that this will form the pilot phase of a full-scale reforestation of the mountains of northern Lanzarote. That sounds like A, doesn't it? He's talking about a more ambitious scheme. I think this more ambitious scheme could be managed 1 of 2 ways, he says. Either the hilltops could be covered with nets to grow new forests all at the same time, or this could be done in stages with smaller numbers of nets being moved around to reforest each area in turn. I think it's clear. I think it's A. After perhaps 2 years of water from the fog collector, saplings would be tall enough to collect fog water themselves. I think we're going to put A in number 41 now. If the initial results scale up, if the initial results are good, a new cloud forest could restore the island to its former glory. I think that's far more coherent. I think that looks much better. I think we're going to say 41 is A. I think 39 is F. Yeah, 39 must be F. Yeah, I think we're going to go with that. The Lanzarote government has targeted an area of about 20 square kilometres in the north of the island, though Rybold believes that the potential area for reforestation using fog collectors could stretch to 50 square kilometres. So it can't be A, B. What about C? Could it be C in number 42? Up to 50 square kilometres. Centuries ago, the island's inhabitants carved tunnels bring life by reinstating the cloud forest, but the knock-on effects of reviving the forests go beyond restoring the wildlife. Hasn't mentioned wildlife in C. I don't think it can be C. We're going to say it's not D. What about E? E. Marciano Acuna, the local town councillor in charge of the environment, says he hopes the trees will trigger a more widespread greening of northern Lanzarote and have an impact on the whole ecology of the region. Once the trees are back, the quality of the soil will improve and a long-lost forest ecosystem will have a chance to return, providing habitat for species long since confined to other islands in the Canaries. Species, we're mentioning wildlife, but the knock-on effects of reviving the forest go beyond restoring wildlife. It looks good. It looks good. I think it's going to be E. So, last one here, and we've got two options. So let's have a look. Beyond the knock-on effects of reviving the forest go beyond restoring the wildlife. Eventually, the forests could or should capture enough moisture to help recharge the area's underground aquifers, many of which have remained empty since the forest disappeared. If this happens, wells down in the valleys could also refill, reducing the island's growing dependence on desalination, especially during the summer tourist season. Especially during the summer tourist season. So we're going to say it's not A, B, could be C, D, E, F, or G. So is it C or G? There are two options. I'm not going into this anymore. So we're talking about the wells. No, wells down in the valleys could also refill, reducing the island's growing dependence on desalination, especially in the summer tourist season. C, centuries ago, seems like an odd time in the article to be going back centuries, but centuries ago the island's inhabitants carved tunnels up the mountainside and into the underground aquifers. These drained into collecting areas lower down. Once the island's main source of water, they could be brought back to life by reinstating the cloud forest. Oh, I don't know about that. Possibly. I mean, they are talking about wells and aquifers. I guess. But it kind of sounds like it's repeating itself now. They should capture enough moisture. Whether or not fog harvesting will prompt a large-scale return to agriculture on the island remains to be seen. I don't know. Let's have a look at G. G is the other possibility. Growing dependence on desalination, especially during the summer tourist season. Farmers would certainly benefit as water in Lanzarote has become very expensive. I guess that would be a reference to the desalination, no? That there would be more water and they wouldn't have to depend so much on what may be an expensive process, I assume, desalination. Taking the salt out of the water. So water in Lanzarote has become very expensive and there are tight restrictions on irrigation of farmland. This has made agriculture increasingly difficult and combined with the rise of tourism, which we've just mentioned as a source of revenue, has turned it into a weekend occupation at best for many residents. And we go on to talk about agriculture in the final paragraph. No, so I think, it's G. No, whether or not fog harvesting will prompt a large-scale return to agriculture on the island remains to be seen. But the lessons learned from harvesting fog on the island's hilltops may be adapted for people living not far away and with a greater need to see their landscape green and watered. If Lanzarote can catch moisture from the air and convert it to forests and farmland, then perhaps its famine-prone neighbours in West Africa do the same. Famine-prone, I don't think that's the term I've heard before. as though they decide to be starving. Anyway, yeah, I think we got it. I think we got all the answers. Let me know if you disagree.